Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the February 2019 webinar for the National Weather Service Spring Hydrologic Outlook. This is Chris Foltz from National Weather Service Central Region Headquarters. Today's briefing will be a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Mississippi Basin, including the Red River of the North and Souris River, as well as the Great Lakes drainages. Additional information and forecasts can be found online at www.weather.gov. Today's presenters are Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Forecast Center, Corey Loveland from the North Central River Forecast Center, Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, James Paul from the Arkansas Red Basin River Forecast Center, and Jeff Grushel from the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center. This webinar is being recorded, and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access the recording early next week. All questions will be held until the end of the presentation. Should you happen to have a question during the presentation, please do go ahead and enter that into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. Let's go ahead and begin with the first presenter, Jim Knoll.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and begin this presentation by really taking a look at the winter precipitation so far across the Mississippi drainage system and the surrounding areas. On the first slide that you'll be looking at, you'll notice on the left image is from last winter, and the right image is this winter for precipitation departures from normal. And the real big message here is the overall Mississippi drainage system, including portions of the Great Lakes and Red River of the North, it's wet. Last year we did have pockets of wet weather in the eastern basin as well as in the upper Missouri Basin. This winter, since December 1st, precipitation has averaged anywhere from about 110 to almost 200% of normal across a good portion of the Mississippi drainage system, all the way from the lower Mississippi Valley to the upper Mississippi Valley. Moving along on the next image to winter temperatures, the upper Midwest, northern plains, upper Mississippi Valley, upper Missouri Valley, very similar this winter in terms of overall temperatures. The last winter being below normal, but exactly how we got there is a little different. We started off in the northern plains and upper Midwest warm, and you'll see that in a few minutes from the North Central River Forecast Center, and then gradually turned colder and colder. Further to the south, however, about the southern half of the Mississippi drainage system, temperatures, even though we had a big burst here in the middle of winter of really cold conditions, temperatures are actually above normal, and that has led to an active jet stream and a wet weather pattern across the region. Moving along to the next slide, this is winter snowfall accumulation of how much snow has fallen in terms of relative to normal. And the big message here is the upper Midwest, upper Mississippi Valley into the northern plains has seen above normal snowfall, and that's really come in the second half of winter. Not so much December, but it's really kicked in during January and especially February. Departures are anywhere from about 100 to 200% of normal, so anywhere up to double in some areas of normal snowfall. However, further south, in the mid-Mississippi Valley into the Ohio Valley, Cumberland, Tennessee Valley, where we do get snowfall, we haven't seen as much snow because a lot of it has fallen as rain. We have had some snow, but overall, snowfall further to the south has been actually below normal. Moving along with our continued overview, we're taking a look at how much water is actually in the snowpack, because it's very important from a river standpoint is the water content within that snowpack. The left image is from February 21st of last year, and the right image is from February 21st yesterday of this year. And what you'll notice is less snow water content in the upper Missouri Basin, but across the northern plains and portions of the upper Mississippi Valley, Red River, the north, extending into the Great Lakes, significantly more water content in that snowpack, which is leading to increased flood risk as we go into the spring season. Moving along to the soil moisture conditions, we were taking a look at this, the widespread nature of just how wet it is across the Mississippi drainage system. Much of the Mississippi drainage system, including portions of the Great Lakes as well, is at what we call the 90th percentile or higher. and that just means that we are on the upper end of wetness in our soil conditions. And those soil conditions are an important factor. When rain falls on soils as we get into spring, that water runs off. The wetter the soils, the more likely to get more runoff and turn the rivers into potential flooding conditions. One of the big notes, the widespread nature. You can see it doesn't matter if you're in the lower Mississippi Valley, Ohio Valley, eastern Missouri Valley, middle and upper Mississippi Valley. It's all green. There's a small image there to the lower left. That was last year. Last year we did not have a significant flood threat overall in a good portion of the system, but this year there is a widespread enhanced risk. This is one of the wettest soil conditions in terms of areal extent for wetness that we've seen in quite a long time. Therefore, because of the wet conditions on the next slide, we have very little drought across the middle portion of the country. There is still some lingering drought in portions of the upper Red and Arkansas basins out into Colorado. But again, overall, very little drought this year. The lower left image, small image, shows last year where we had definitely more dry conditions in the northern plains, extending all the way down into the central and southern plains. Moving along to how these wet conditions this winter are responding into our streams, we are seeing a lot of blue, and this is the last 28-day average stream flow condition. And so much above normal stream flow conditions and river conditions across really a good portion of the Mississippi drainage system, including the Ohio, Tennessee, and Cumberland valleys as well. A couple other notes to note, because of the cold weather over the last month to month and a half, we've seen a lot of ice action, and overall ice jam action is considered at or above normal risk. Especially in the upper Mississippi Valley and portions of the Missouri Valley as we go over the next 4 to 6 weeks. Further to the east in the Ohio Valley, most of that ice is gone. On the next slide is taking a look at how much flood storage by the Army Corps of Engineers throughout the system has been used. And you'll notice kind of using that solid line in the middle, the dark blue line, that's representing the Mississippi drainage system. To the left of that, almost complete flood storage capacity is available. Very little has been used. In the Missouri Basin, it shows near 0%, the Arkansas at 11.3%, and the red at 4.5%. Now, further to the east, as we get into that wetter area, you can see that the flood storage capacity used is around 21% used in the Ohio River Basin, the Cumberland River Basin's at 50%, the Tennessee River Basin's at 28% used, and the Yazoo River is currently at 18.4% used. This information was provided by the Army Corps of Engineers. Now, they have plenty of storage capacity available overall in the system, but again, it's just showing you the wetness starting to kick in the eastern portion of that system. Now we're going to switch gears and take a look at the outlook here from the next week to the next several months. And then from the weather side of the outlooks and the climate outlooks, we'll transition into the river outlooks. We have a significant storm system currently beginning to move into the middle of the country, and a heavy rain event is unfolding from today into at least the first portion of the weekend. From the lower Mississippi Valley into the Tennessee, Cumberland, and lower Ohio Valley, we're up to 3 to 5 inches of rain is possible, which will create additional flooding on top of already saturated and flooding conditions. Further to the northwest of the low pressure center track this weekend, there will be additional water content from Iowa, northwest Missouri, and on up into Minnesota and Wisconsin. And a lot of that water content from the precipitation will be going into the snowpack and even adding additional water to that snowpack. We do expect a pattern change from what we've seen recently, and the pattern will be switching here, and we'll see that in a minute, to a colder pattern. And the weather pattern will be shifting quickly from west to east with a series of storm systems. But one of the things that will do is it will wet up the northern Rockies with a significant amount of snowfall over the next week. And that's that area you'll see in portions of western Montana to western Wyoming. Those red areas are up to over 3 inches of water in that snowfall that's expected into next week there. So there is a little bit of a pattern change that is underway. Looking further ahead into week 2, or the March 1st to 6th outlook into early March of 2019, that pattern change will continue with a lot of blue across the entire Mississippi drainage system, including the Great Lakes, and a pretty good likelihood of below normal temperatures across the entire system. At the same time, we will get a little relief in terms of the upper Midwest into the Great Lakes and maybe the Ohio Valley, with precipitation relaxing back to more normal or a little bit below normal. But across the lower Mississippi Valley into the Tennessee Valley and back further, especially to the Northwest and portions of the Missouri drainage system, above normal precipitation is expected into early March. Looking further ahead on the next slide is our Climate Prediction Center of the National Weather Service's March outlook. And it continues that trend of early March throughout the month of March of below normal temperatures across a good portion of the Mississippi drainage system. At the same time, above normal precipitation is expected on the right image there in green from the lower Mississippi Valley into the Tennessee, Cumberland, and Ohio valleys. For the rest of the basin, equal chances are forecast. And so there's no real dominant pattern being indicated for above normal or below normal precipitation. But again, there is that risk of even in areas shown in the white across the upper Mississippi and the Missouri Basin, it could be normal, or it could even be above normal precipitation there as well. Looking further ahead into the springtime, up all the way through May, temperatures are expected to be close to or maybe slightly above normal across most of the basin, while precipitation generally will be at or above normal. The above normal risk is primarily in the southern half of the Mississippi drainage system, but again, we can't rule out above normal precipitation even in the upper Mississippi Valley, upper Missouri Valley, and Great Lakes. And because of the general overall risk of either at or above normal precipitation, and with soil conditions already wet, we really don't expect any drought conditions in most of the system. And the drought conditions that are ongoing in Colorado should improve slightly in most of that area. At least that's the current forecast from the Climate Prediction Center of the National Weather Service in NOAA. So now we're going to switch gears on the next slide and get into what does all this wetness mean in terms of the flood outlook. Right now, as you can see, unlike last year, this year it does pose a risk for much more significant flooding across the system. You'll see a lot of areas of orange, red, and purple across the system. And what we're expecting is fairly widespread, minor to moderate flooding across a good portion of the Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland Valley, the Mississippi drainage system, and the eastern Missouri drainage system. And some flooding is also expected in the eastern portions of the Arkansas Red Basin. Areas of moderate, major flooding, that is, are also possible, especially in the upper half of the Mississippi drainage system because of all that snow water content in the snowpack right now, and that also extends into a little bit of the eastern portion of the Missouri drainage system. The big message here is more widespread flooding than last year and really the last several years. So now we're going to break it down into each of the River Forecast Center basins and get into a little bit more detail. So with that, we will begin in the Ohio and Cumberland Basin in the eastern portion of the Mississippi drainage system. For Indiana and Illinois, at least eastern Illinois, we are expecting minor to moderate flooding across the Wabash, Little Wabash, and White River Basin systems into April of 2019. Minor flooding is expected over portions of northeastern Indiana in the Maumee River Basin system. Further to the south in the Kentucky and Tennessee area, minor to moderate flooding is expected in the Cumberland, Green, Kentucky, Licking, and Green basins. Some major flooding cannot be ruled out in the lower portion of the Ohio River and Cumberland River basins. In Ohio, minor flooding is expected in the Maumee, Muskingum, Scioto, and Great Miami watersheds. And for the main stem Ohio River itself, we are expecting minor to moderate flooding, especially from Cincinnati and downstream, or the lower half of the Ohio River Basin. If we take a little bit more detailed look, instead of at the 50% chance, we are also looking at the 25% chance here. So there's still a 25% chance or greater of minor to moderate flooding really across much of the Ohio River Basin system. And that also includes some potential for some major flooding, especially in Kentucky and into Middle Tennessee. One other thing we want to highlight, since we already have ongoing significant flooding in the Ohio River Basin system and the storm system coming up this weekend, we are expecting widespread minor to moderate flooding to continue in Kentucky and Tennessee and expand somewhat. Isolated major flooding cannot be ruled out with the system even this weekend in portions of Kentucky and Tennessee. So in summary, for the Ohio and Cumberland River Basins, we are expecting minor to moderate flooding for most of the system this spring. Some major flooding is possible, mainly along into the south of the Ohio River. Overall, flood risk is above normal for the Ohio and Cumberland River Basins. The exception would be the upper Ohio River Basin and the Lake Erie watersheds draining into the Great Lakes, where near normal flood risk is expected. Rainfall and thunderstorms, of course, will determine the final outcome of the flood threat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey Loveland up at the North Central River Forecast Center to talk about the upper Mississippi River system and surrounding areas.
Corey, are you there? We're not hearing your audio.
If not, Chris, I can probably continue. We'll give him about a minute or so.
Sounds good, Jim. Alternately, we could also go ahead and go on to Kevin at the Missouri Basin, then come back to Corey. Let's go ahead and plan on doing that if we can.
Sure. All right. Let's go ahead and go over to the Missouri River Basin then.
Okie doke. Thank you, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone. Flood risk for this spring in the Missouri River Basin is basically divided between the west and the east. The western portion of the basin, including Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and the western portion of the Dakotas, the western portions of Nebraska and Kansas, all have a reduced risk for flooding as compared to historic normals. The rest of the basin, the eastern half, has an increased risk for flooding as compared to historic normals. The graphic that you see here is intended to show a comparison of the probability to reach flood stage this spring as compared to the historic probability of reaching flood stage. And as such, this graphic does not show whether we expect a certain location to make it to flood stage or not. That's not the point. It simply shows whether conditions are more favorable or less favorable for any one of these sites to see flooding. Cool colors, blues and greens, indicate a reduced risk for flooding, and warm colors, yellows and oranges, indicate an increased risk for flooding. And so, as you can see, the western half has a reduced risk, and the eastern half has an increased risk to see flooding this spring. Going to the next slide, we'll look at the mountains. This graphic, courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, shows the mountainous basin snowpack conditions in percent of median snow water equivalent. Mountain snowpack can be categorized as generally near normal in the mountainous west of the Missouri Basin. Looking at individual basins, the Milk River Basin is below normal. The upper Missouri River Basin above Fort Peck is near normal, as is the Yellowstone. And the Platte system, both North and South Platte, is slightly above normal. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated about 70% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountainous west. And so we still have a ways to go and things could change, but for right now, basically we're near normal. With the next slide, we'll see the water supply forecast issued by the National Weather Service on February the 4th. And it suggests a slightly below average mountain runoff year volumetrically speaking, for the mountainous west. Significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone is not projected this year. Moving then on to the plains, as Jim has already sort of went over a little bit, plains snow does exist for the majority of the Missouri River Basin, and this is the next slide, please. Thank you. And this is sort of unusual. The heaviest amounts of plains snow is to be found in eastern South Dakota, where observations range from 3 to 5 inches, with some amounts in excess of 5 inches. And with the next slide, I will begin to go state by state, highlighting those basins where we have a better than 50% chance of seeing some category of flooding. Beginning with North Dakota, minor flooding is likely along Spring Creek and the Little Muddy Creek. In South Dakota, minor flooding is expected along the Vermilion, the Grand, and the Little Missouri Rivers. Moderate level flooding is expected along the James and White Rivers, and major flooding is projected for the Big Sioux Basin. With the next slide, we'll move southward into Nebraska and Iowa. Minor flooding is expected within the Big Blue Basin and the Loup Basins in Nebraska. The Elkhorn and Platte River Basins each have locations that we expect to reach major flood levels, but overall, the Elkhorn and Platte can be categorized as having generally moderate level flooding risk. In Iowa, the Nishnabotna River is expected to see minor flooding, while the Floyd River Basin will experience moderate level flooding. Both the Little Sioux and the Big Sioux Basins in Iowa are likely to experience major flooding. Moving southward, and we'll close with this, moving into the states of Kansas and Missouri. Typically, springtime flooding in this lower third of the basin is driven by thunderstorm activity. Well, this year we also have snow as an early driver as well. In Kansas, minor flooding is projected for the Big Blue and her tributaries, and many of the smaller tributaries to the lower Kansas main stem. We also expect minor flooding in the Republican River Basin, and moderate level flooding is likely in the Smoky Hill, the Meredith and the Little Osage River Basins. In the state of Missouri, minor flooding is likely along the Sheraton and Osage rivers, as well as many of the smaller tributaries to the Missouri main stem. Moderate level flooding is likely along Crooked, Blackwater, Lamine, Sac, South Grand, the Tarkio, and the Platte River in Missouri. The Missouri River main stem, downstream from Nebraska City to St. Louis, is also expected to see episodic periods of minor to moderate flooding this spring as well. If you actually look at the actual AHAP's graphics for the main stem Missouri, you will see a couple of locations where the graphics indicate a 50-50 chance of seeing major. And I would like to state that I believe that those are a bit overdone. So I do not expect major flooding on the Missouri River this year. Moving then to the summary slide. Snowpack in the mountains is about average for this time of year. There exists an appreciable plains snowpack, and that will play a significant role in flood potential this spring. We've already seen quite a bit of river ice buildup to date, and with the cold temperatures projected into late March, I expect to see a buildup of even more river ice. And so as we move toward warmer temperatures, we will have to monitor for breakup ice jam flooding. We do not expect widespread or significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone. However, wet conditions, current plains snowpack, and frozen ground conditions have all resulted in a much increased risk for flooding in the eastern half of the Missouri Basin. Thank you. This concludes the flood potential brief for the Missouri, and I'll turn it back over to Corey at North Central.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you, Corey.
Okay, thank you. I think I had some technical difficulties with my headset. I'm sorry about that. I apologize. So let's back up, reverse, go up to the North Central River Forecast Center. So just to continue the story with the widespread winter precipitation above normal precipitation pattern that we've experienced here in the upper Mississippi Basin, specifically in the North Dakota area, widespread over Minnesota and Wisconsin into northern Illinois and most of Iowa. We've have had a widespread 200 to 300% above normal precipitation pattern, basically beginning around January 19th to current date. That picture wasn't the same in the fall. As far as October went, November, we were pretty dry. But looking at September and October with our late summer rains, we had some heavy precipitation in a fairly wet pattern. And like I mentioned, November was pretty dry, and then December was a mixed pattern where we were mostly wet in the Minnesota and Iowa area, and the remainder of the River Forecast Center area was fairly dry. But as I mentioned, going into January or the late January and during February, we've been very wet. Let's go to the next slide, please. So with our snow water content across the basins, again, just as been mentioned, we're very wet. We have a widespread snow cover with a high water content throughout the basins. Some of our highest amounts are in the 14 to 18 inches around the upper peninsula, which we experience quite frequently here. But mostly widespread, we're right now in the 2 to 8 inches of snow water equivalent. Next slide, please. So this graphic essentially shows our current modeled snow water equivalent inside our modeling system here, compared to our historical trends in our model. And the higher the number, the higher the percentage indicates that we're seeing a lot of wet conditions as compared to the historical trend. So as you can see, across the RC basins, we're really in the 50 to 100% ranking compared to historical trends. And that's quite extensive throughout the basin. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the temperatures going into the fall and the winter, right? Into the winter, going December, starting with December. We've been 2 to 5 degrees above normal, so we had a fairly warm December time frame. January, we were below normal with a 1 to 5 degrees below normal. And then, as I mentioned, February has been very cold. And as you can see from the graphic, we've been mostly 2 to 18 degrees below normal, especially in the North and South Dakota area and in western Minnesota. So it's been especially cold in the last 3 weeks here. Go to the next slide. So this slide right here is indicating some of the frigid temperatures that we've had. I know when we talk about our forecasting for our spring flood outlook, the frost depths are important as far as determining how the water might come off of the basins. And here it's just demonstrating this January 22nd through the 31st, where we had very frigid temperatures in the 17 to 21 degrees below normal, mostly over Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, eastern Iowa, and northern Illinois. I've marked a red line here indicating basically the area south of that marked red line there is essentially where we can probably see enhanced runoff with deeper that we might have deeper frost levels in those areas. With when it froze, there was not really an insulating layer of snow to help protect those soils. So below that line, we could probably see essentially additional runoff or enhanced runoff in that area. Going to the next slide, talking a little bit about the frost depths as well. Generally across the Iowa and southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois area, we're seeing about 1 foot to 2 feet of frost depths in those basins. So basically having that shallow snow cover, not insulating the soils at the time of freezing there. Going to the next slide, here's the meat of the discussion here with our flood potential outlook, looking through the February and through April timeframe. Essentially, I guess the story is along the Mississippi River, we're seeing an above to much above normal flood risk extending across southern Minnesota into Wisconsin, and of course down the main stem Mississippi River. As you can see, there's a number of purples and red indications there of the stream gauges of having a greater than 50% normal or chance of exceeding flood levels there. And then upwards in the northern headwaters of the Mississippi and Minnesota, we're seeing above normal flood risk in the headwaters there. And down below in Iowa, across Iowa, and also into the Great Lakes area, we're seeing above normal flood risk even into Illinois and Indiana and across Michigan. And of note, also these outlooks include the forecasted precipitation from tonight through Sunday as well. And if we go to the next slide, we can talk about the Souris and the Red River of the North and the Devil's Lake drainages. First of all, with the Red River, we're in the normal to above normal flood risk, at least in there, seeing some of the reds and the purples along the Red River. It's kind of a different story up in the Souris Basin, where we're near normal to normal flood risk there. And then in the Devil's Lake Basin, basically a normal flood risk and a normal inflow into the Devil's Lake Basin. Let's next slide talks a little bit about the ice jam threat that we've seen. We're in basically a normal to above normal forecast conditions with ice jams. The picture here shows some ice-caused flooding on the Skunk River at Augusta, Iowa, early February this year. So with the extended cold temperatures from January to now, we're forecasting that the ice jams will continue, and that we've seen some scattered flooding, major flooding along northern Illinois and Iowa in the recent weeks, and we've also seen a number of moderate flooding as well in some other locations. We also forecast that some of these breakup ice jams will continue in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So ongoing flooding should result with that. Going to the last slide here with the flood potential summary. So to wrap it up, flood risk is above to much above normal in the upper Mississippi, including the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, northern Indiana, and into Missouri. And also a near normal to above normal flood risk in the Hudson Bay Basin, and then also in the Great Lakes, also an above normal flood risk. Depending on, but this all depends on what will happen in the next 4 to 6 weeks as we see the temperatures and the precipitation trends, as far as how fast and it can come, the snow can melt and come off and possibly increase the flooding risk. So we'll just have to stay tuned and see how it comes off and see if we have any significant rainfall. And with that, I think I will turn it over to James for the Arkansas Red.
Thanks, Corey. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to briefly go over the Arkansas Red Basin's current conditions, and I will go ahead and state up front the outlook this year calls for a near normal risk of flooding for our entire basin. Starting out west, these two plots give a good indication where the upper part of the Arkansas River stands with respect to snow water equivalent. As of a couple days ago, it was at 124% of normal. And looking at the graphic in the lower right, this year's snow water equivalent, as shown by the black line, is currently running about 2.5 inches higher than normal, the green line, with about 2 more months of accumulating potential before the melt kicks in around May 1st. Next slide, please. This image shows our RFC's estimates of precipitation since January 1st compared to normal. You can see, just like has been earlier mentioned, we've been pretty wet out in the eastern part, drier out to the southwest. Much of the eastern third of the basin has received at least 150% of normal precipitation over the last 2 months. Northeast New Mexico and the Texas Panhandle have not fared as well and remain pretty dry.
Our modeled soil moisture, which is not shown here, mirrors this precipitation map with those areas with anomalously high soil moisture content in the same locations generally as the above normal precipitation. Next slide. Because we have been relatively wet over the last couple of months, there are quite a few reservoirs that are utilizing at least some of their respective flood storage capacity. This map shows it's a couple days old, so some of the numbers may be slightly different as of this morning and this afternoon as they continue some of their releases. However, the exception of a few lakes in Arkansas and southeast Oklahoma, most of them have more than 90% of flood storage still remaining, so they can capture any excess runoff from spring storms. And on my last slide, please. On this map, you can see that we have several locations where the chances of at least minor flooding are greater than 50%. However, most of these are either locations that typically flood during a normal spring, or they are currently at higher levels, so the long-term probability is skewed a little high. As a reminder, most of the spring flooding that does occur within the Arkansas Red Basin is driven by convective storms, which can occur over any portion of our watershed. Although we are generally wet across the eastern half of the basin, there is no significant indication of any widespread flooding on any particular river system. So our outlook is calling for a near normal risk of flooding for the basin. And with that, I'll pass it off to Jeff Groschel at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
Alrighty, thank you, James. Pretty much the same story that our upstream offices have been talking about, specifically at North Central and OHRC. It's been a sea of blue here. We've had 10 to 20 inches of rainfall that have fallen across our area over the last couple of months, and that's not including the 5 to 10 inches that we had overnight over portions of Mississippi and Tennessee. So we're probably approaching over 30 inches of rainfall over the last couple of months over portions of this area. So obviously the stream flow and the soil moisture conditions are well above normal for a large portion of our area. Next slide. Jim kind of gave an overview already of the flood storage available for our area. And in fact, this is just a map from yesterday, and already with the heavier rainfall that we saw in the Yazoo Basin and heavier rainfall that's fallen in the Tennessee tributaries, these numbers are actually a little bit lower than what is actually happening currently right now. And probably on the Yazoo Basin, will probably be, with the rainfall that we had overnight, we'll probably still utilize up to almost 40 to 50% of the utilization of flood control storage in the Yazoo Basin. So again, with wet conditions across the area, the Yazoo and the Tennessee tributaries and stuff have been utilizing a lot more of the available storage that they have, but we'll continue to have storage over the next few months, though. As you go further to the west in the Red Basin and over in the southwest parts of Arkansas, just like James had indicated, things are a little bit drier over there compared to how things are into the north and east, so in better shape in those areas than we have further eastward. Next slide. As far as our forecast, we've got moderate to major flooding currently going on across the lower Ohio and the lower Mississippi River. So right now it's just a flood wave. We're really not going to look at getting cresting conditions on the current forecast that we have now until mid to almost late March. So we're going to have very elevated river levels and stuff for the next several months across the lower Mississippi Valley. So with that and any additional rainfall that we were to get in spring, along with the snow potential melt that Corey had alluded to, we are really looking for moderate to major flooding potential for the lower part of the Ohio and the lower part of the Mississippi. Over in the Tennessee Valley, we do have an outlook of minor to moderate, but there's possibility of some isolated major flooding also with the very wet conditions that we are currently having there at this time. As we go further down into Louisiana, Mississippi, things have been a little bit drier, especially in the southern parts of those states. So we're really, anytime we can really get minor to moderate flooding with any spring rainfall that we get in those areas, and the same holds true for this year. Elsewhere on the Red, we are looking at just seasonal flooding. Again, we can get minor flooding and even moderate flooding, even in a relatively normal rainfall event across our area and those Red and red portions of the area in northeast Texas and the northwest parts of Louisiana. So, next slide. So basically, to sum it up, because we have moderate to major flooding currently going on right now in the lower Ohio and lower Mississippi, that's really not going to change through the outlook period. Obviously, the flood risk is well above normal for the Tennessee and the lower Mississippi Valley, and really the future crests that we look at on the lower part of the Ohio and the lower part of the Mississippi are really going to be dependent on the rainfall and thunderstorms that we have this spring in the Ohio Valley and the Mississippi Valley, and how that in combination with any spring melt that we get on the upper parts of the Missouri and the Mississippi River come true. So, and with that, I will turn it back over to Jim.
All right there. Thank you, Jeff. And we'll just go ahead and summarize this all up in a nutshell, and that is, due to the current very wet conditions across a good portion of the Mississippi drainage system, the region is vulnerable to future storm systems as we go into late winter and especially into spring. Above normal flood risk is expected across the upper, middle, and lower Mississippi basins. This includes the main stem Mississippi River, eastern Missouri Basin, most of the Ohio River Basin, the Cumberland and Tennessee River Basins. In addition, this also includes the Red River of the North and much of the Great Lakes. Normal flood risk is forecast for the Souris, Upper Ohio, and Arkansas and Red Basins, and the only area of below normal risk currently being forecast is for the Western Missouri Basin. Therefore, it is important that you monitor future forecasts and outlooks, and our next update briefing and webinar will be on March 7th at 2:30 Central Standard Time. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Chris now to take any questions.
All right, thanks, Jim. So just a reminder, if you do have a question for any of the presenters today, please do type that question into the questions box there on the GoTo GUI. Right now, we just have one question that's been posed in there so far. So hopefully while we're getting this one addressed, if there are any other questions, you can go ahead and put those in. So this one's for Kevin, and the question is do you have any forecast points along the Murrow River in northwestern South Dakota? And they're asking that because the no-risk analysis shows a large snowpack in that area, but you were indicating that you thought about western South Dakota would be below average for a flood risk. So could you take a look and address that for him?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we do have locations on the Murrow. We've got a forecast location at Faith, South Dakota, at Whitehorse, South Dakota. I guess those are the two. They're both below the 50 percentile for minor. Murrow at Faith has a 25% chance of getting to flood, and Murrow at Whitehorse has a 43%. Both of those are about triple the historic norm. So it is an increase over historic normals, but neither one has a 50% chance of reaching flood, and therefore that's why they're not flagged.
All right, Kevin, appreciate that. We did have one other question come in so far, and that's going to be for looks like it'll be for Corey here. It's regarding the eastern Dakotas, and any more specific information you've got for potential for ice jams across eastern portions of North or South Dakota?
I think it's probably just going to continue. It really depends on the temperatures that we're going to foresee, I guess, in the near future. The cold, James showed the 8 to 14 day outlook for the temperatures, and the forecast is supposed to be well below normal with all that dark blue that we saw. So I imagine that at least the threat for additional ice jams will at least stay or continue to be as it has been for a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Corey. Hopefully that'll answer the question that was asked by Andre there. So those are the only two questions we had so far. I got a okay thanks there from Andre, so I think your information helped him out there. Appreciate that, Corey. So no other questions at this point, so we'll give it just about 30 seconds. If you've got one final question, please go ahead and type that in. And here's another one that just came in from Blaine Johnson, Corey. It says, what is the storage capacity for the upper Minnesota River Basin? Where are things looking for that?
For the upper Minnesota River Basin for the storage capacity?
Yeah.
Well, basically, where our ESP graphics were showing that we're well above normal with the snowpack, and so I guess I just have to answer that it's well above normal at this point in time, based on the amount of liquid water in our snowpack at this time.
Okay, and one other question for you here, Corey. It seems like you're the big winner right now. So on the slide, and Jim, you may need to go back to the slide that this references, but it's asking about the slide that had the red line on it. Could you elaborate a little bit what the red line means?
Yeah, so essentially, I tried to indicate, I try to indicate, in the presentation, essentially that frost depths are really critical for our runoff in the spring. Essentially, how deep the frost is or the frozen soils are. So the deeper, essentially, or the more frozen the soils, the higher the potential is for spring runoff. To have basically the water run over the surface of the soil profile, and so basically it would enhance the chance of overland flooding and cause additional flooding in low-lying areas and also in the river basins as well. So I tried to look at it's just looking at the red line, and what I placed there is generally we look at around 4 inches or snow or so of snow cover. Or less, with those shallow snow covers, then it really doesn't insulate that ground surface from freezing. And so, because obviously the thicker the snow you have, it insulates the ground, so you have those shallower snow depths. And so I was looking basically at what areas that we've had that shallow, maybe 4 inches of snow cover or less. And that's where I kind of came up with that line. So essentially, those hard or those frost depths are deeper in those areas, which is kind of confirmed with the next slide that I showed with the individual site frost depths as well, kind of in the 1 to 2 foot range there.
And so just a clarification that was asked about that. So southern Minnesota, southern portions of Wisconsin, eastern Iowa, northern Illinois, those locations have an enhanced risk for runoff? Is that what you're indicating?
Yeah, I would say, I would agree with that, essentially, as compared to normal years, because we don't usually see that those deep frost depths in the northern Illinois and Iowa areas. This is kind of an exception with that really frigid cold temperatures that we received end of January, early February.
Okay, great. I think that answered the question there. One more here for you, Corey, specifically about the northern Red River Valley there in North Dakota. How does the moisture content there stack up against historic norms? Where are we at in terms of like comparison to normal for that historically?
Well, I think basin-wide we're in the 3 to 5 inches of snow water equivalent across the Red River Basin. I think that's above normal from what we're seeing right now. So, yeah, I would just say it's an above normal snow water content.
Okay.
But also having said that, it was fairly dry last summer as well. So it's kind of a little bit of that is recovering from, or the additional snowpack is a little bit recovering from drier conditions from last summer.
All right, sounds good. We had somebody specifically asking about the flood outlook for the Illinois River drainage area. Is there more that you can elaborate on what we've talked about with that already?
Yeah, I guess with the slide that's showing here, I guess Illinois is definitely a major tributary into the Mississippi, and as you can see, there's a number of purple and red squares there. So essentially, that's with the snowpack and the frozen soils and the precipitation forecast, I think we would categorize that in the above to much above normal flood risk along the Illinois.
All right, we're kind of getting into some specific drainages here, so we may need to connect you with these individuals. But someone was asking about also the Cannonball River at Bryan, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, in North Dakota.
Yeah, this is Kevin. Yeah, we're the Cannonball at Breen has a 42% chance of getting to flood. I mean, that's the number they would come up with. And that is slightly above historic. Historic is about 40. So, but again, it doesn't hit the 50. So we're not, since it doesn't have a 50% chance, we don't flag it as that we expect flooding to happen on the Cannonball.
And do you guys have specific numbers for the Heart River and Mandan? That's going to be probably Corey.
Yeah, no, that's me too.
Is that you? Okay.
Yeah, hang on just a second.
Sure.
Yeah, Heart at Mandan, it's 16% chance of reaching minor flood stage.
All right, and one more question that we've had submitted. Thanks for everybody for submitting the questions. So the last one we've got right now, this is probably going to be for Jim over in the Ohio. So asking about how up to date the storage capacity numbers are for the Cumberland.
Yeah, so the storage capacity numbers for the Cumberland Basin are up to date as of this morning. Now we do have that heavy rain event that is ongoing right now, and so right now it's about 50% used. Wolf Creek is the biggest project that has a lot of storage capacity, and that may push like 60 or more % used when this storm goes through. So we're working closely with the Army Corps of Engineers, and all of our forecasts are well coordinated between the Corps of Engineers. We work with the USGS and that, but these numbers are as of this morning, February 22nd. We got this directly from the Army Corps of Engineers. So these are up to date for the entire Mississippi drainage system as of this morning. But they will be changing, especially east of the Mississippi River up into the Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland valleys quite a bit here over the next 24 to 48 hours.
All right, great. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. Okay, guys, I'm not seeing any other questions at this particular moment. Maybe give it another 10 seconds or so just to see if there's any last comments, questions, or concerns. Just to reiterate the fact that we did record this webinar, so it will be made available. Probably we won't be able to send that out until Monday, but we'll get that information out to you as soon as possible. Also, early next week, we'll be sending out the invitations to register for the follow-up webinar, which, again, as was referenced, will take place at 2:30 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, March 7th. So look for that email coming out early part of next week. And again, that's we'll send the information out just as soon as we get through. We wanted to get through this briefing first. So I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar for today. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks.